This week, the door closed even further on Senate Republicans' efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Some South Florida lawmakers stepped up calls for a bipartisan compromise.
And among them was Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She has also proposed taking away the security clearance of Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and a key advisor. The Congresswoman is in town this weekend, and earlier she spoke with us about those topics and more. Congresswoman, great to have you come in.
Good morning. Thanks. Good morning. Great to be with you.
All right, so the Senate GOP health care bill failed. The president's proposal to just repeal Obamacare failed. What comes now?
Well, apparently the Senate Republicans are going back into sort of executive session, as they say, and trying to see if they can find a way to pass something that can get the 50 votes plus the vice president's. But they're still pursuing straight repeal, which the CBO score that came out says will actually cause 32 million people
15
to lose
million
them.
Next year would lose their insurance.
And then over 10 years, 32 million. So they're going in the wrong direction and causing millions of people to lose their health care coverage, cutting out coverage for pre-existing conditions, restoring lifetime and annual caps. Yeah. It's the most outrageous piece of legislation.
Well, do they plan to do this before the August recess? The president said to the senators the other day, the GOP senators, don't leave Washington without giving me a health care bill.
Right. Their obsession with taking health care away from people and making sure that it remains a right and doesn't go back to becoming a privilege only for the people that can afford it is outrageous. We have 1 week left until the August recess, and from what I understand, the Senate is going to take another crack at voting on a straight repeal, which again would leave 32 million people over 10 years and 15 million people next year without coverage.
I think it's worth it to say, Congresswoman, that there is a real backlash against Obamacare as it stands now by a lot of people, and really as it stands, 6 or 7 million people cannot get insurance, and even congressional Democrats are saying it's not perfect, and it needs fixing. So I would love to hear what you think the fixes should and can be to the Affordable Care Act as it stands now to make it better and cover more people and lower costs.
Sure. Well, first of all, we actually have an overwhelming majority of people who have weighed in across the country and said to House and Senate Republicans, don't repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's why they can't get the votes to do it, because people now we've had 20 million people gain access to coverage. People have protections from being discriminated against for pre-existing conditions. They have comprehensive coverage that actually makes sure that when they're sick, they can get their illness and ailment taken care of. But there are problems with the Affordable Care Act, and what Democrats have said is instead of continuing to try to repeal it and replace it with something that is bare bones, let's sit down and work together to address the problems. Some of the problems are that there are, in numerous places around the country, very little choice in terms of competition among companies that provide policies, and we do need to address that particular problem. And
if I could interrupt, your colleague Mario Diaz-Balart of Miami says, I believe in Collier County, which he represents, one insurer is going to write policies in the next year, and without competition, they could charge exorbitant amounts.
Well, and that's absolutely what I'm referring to. Is one of the problems is that in some places there is only one choice. But what we need to do is sit down and not repeal the Affordable Care Act. There are ways to solve that, and the ways not to solve it. What Republicans under this administration have done is intentionally sabotaged the Affordable Care Act and made administrative changes that have caused insurers to leave the market. Unfortunately, Senator Rubio, our own senator, championed the elimination of risk corridors that allow insurance companies to balance out their losses so that we can make sure that affordable coverage is available. So we can, if we're willing to what the Republicans need to do is just acknowledge that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, set aside repeal, come to the table. The American people have heavily weighed in and said, just work together to make sure that there's comprehensive affordable coverage available across the country.
How, though, can you ever make a healthcare system for all? How do you make that work without addressing the insurance industry? I mean, I will tell you, my family recently had a medical experience, and insurance companies dictate healthcare. They do.
Well, one way is to pass a public option. What Democrats tried to do, we passed it out of the House. A public option would provide an additional form of coverage that would be like a Medicare type policy.
So Medicare for all?
No, this would not be Medicare for all. This is in the exchanges, you add a public option policy, which helps keep the private insurers honest and injects some additional competition so that at least, let's say in Collier County, and we can do other things too, but in Collier County, if we had a public option, then consumers would have the choice between the one insurance company that's available and the public option. And that would at least, if there weren't other insurers chiming in to offer policies, at least cause that private insurer to try to be competitive with the public option.
Right. Let's move on, if we can, to another big topic, one important to you. You introduced 2 amendments to an appropriations bill last week, which failed in committee, Republican-controlled committee, to strip Jared Kushner of his security clearance. Why should he lose his security clearance?
Because Jared Kushner is one of the most senior advisors to the president, and he is under investigation for collusion during the Trump campaign with the Russian government to help
he's
Donald
innocent
Trump.
Until Robert Mueller or his people find
something. Right now
something.
he has access to the most sensitive information, intelligence information in our country, and he has repeatedly, additionally, failed to honestly and accurately report his meetings with foreign governments, including the government of Russia, which is a foreign enemy state. He's had to amend his forms 3 times. Now, look, this is a person who wasn't involved in government, who wasn't having, before he was involved in his father-in-law's campaign, dozens and dozens of meetings with foreign leaders. I find it hard to believe that he would forget over 100 different meetings that he left off his forms. So he has proven multiple times that he is not trustworthy to be able to have access to our country's most sensitive intelligence information when he is right in the ear of the President of the United States.
As we are having this conversation on a Friday morning, the headlines this morning, Friday, are that the President is looking for ways, having conversations with his legal team about, is it possible to pardon himself, his family? What do you make of that?
It's incredibly disturbing because let's be very clear. When a pardon is offered and accepted by a president to an individual, the acceptance of that pardon is an admission of guilt under the law. So, I mean,
can you pardon someone without having the admission or conviction of guilt prior to the pardon?
No. In fact, that's the other definition of pardon. Implicitly in the word pardon is that an illegal act was committed that you would need to be pardoned for. So they can't anticipate being convicted. You have to have actually had an act that you've committed, and a president has the ability to pardon someone for it. There is a major question mark over whether a president can pardon himself, but the further cloud that that is descending over the White House is made even darker by the fact that the White House staff and his campaign and the president himself have repeatedly said that this is all nonsense and there's nothing to see here. Well, if there was nothing to see here, why are you investigating whether or not you can pardon yourself for something that you're not guilty of?
If I can just finish that thought, what I find, to your point, fascinating also is that CNN has a poll out now that shows that Americans, now a slight majority of Americans since March, have a declining interest in the Russian investigation. Why that is, the poll doesn't say, possibly because the interest is turning to more issues that affect, like healthcare, their lives. But with all that has come out and the continuing and right now the New York Times interview with the president where he says he would not have hired Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, if he knew
he was going to recuse himself in the Russia investigation.
Thank you. And
if he had known that the Attorney General was going to do the right thing and actually do the ethical thing by recusing himself when there was a question
mark. Does that surprise you that a majority of Americans now just kind of aren't concerned about the Russia investigation, according to this poll?
What that poll also said was that more and more Americans, a majority of Democrats and more than a third of Republicans actually believe that there is something to the accusations about collusion and the president's campaign's involvement with Russia to influence the outcome of the election. So an investigation like this, by its definition, is going to be lengthy. I think the public is going to have bouts of fatigue over it, but I mean, I was a child. You and I were children during the Nixon investigation and impeachment and Watergate, and eventually, when the investigation led to directly to the footsteps, the doorstep of the president, that's when everything came to a head, and it's getting closer and closer to that.
All right, just let me stipulate, as you lawyers like to say, I was not a child then. I was a young reporter.
Right.
All right, Congresswoman, before we end this interview, we need to ask you about Venezuela.
Yes.
It's in a chaotic state. As we are speaking, the government there is conducting this faux election about a constituent assembly to rewrite the Constitution. You have thousands of Venezuelans, some of them American citizens as well, who live in your district, live in Weston. What about sanctions, which the president said we're going to impose sanctions on Venezuela if they go ahead with this election, and they're going ahead with it?
Right. Well, we had nearly 17,000 people in Weston alone, and I have one of the largest Venezuelan populations in my district in the country, as you said, turn out to send a very strong message in an election last Sunday. Yes, that said, we are opposed to a constituent assembly, do not tamper with our Constitution. We have people in Venezuela who are starving, who are unable to get access to nutritious food. What the Maduro is trying to play with the Supreme Court and have the Supreme Court make changes. If that constituent assembly goes forward on July 30th, their goal obviously is to eliminate democratic principles, the rule of law, and we need to send a strong message from the United States that that is unacceptable. Levy sanctions, which I'm glad to see that the administration is moving in that direction and making it very clear that we will ratchet up and even consider banning oil imports from Venezuela, which I know we have not been willing to go that far in the past. But the situation is dire in Venezuela, and we need to use the moral authority and leverage of the United States to weigh in strongly and do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
And the unintended consequences maybe of the U.S. pulling out of all oil imports from Venezuela are devastating economic consequences for the people of Venezuela.
And that's what really is heartbreaking. Is in a sense you balance making things worse for the Venezuelan people, but at the same time over the long run, making sure that they don't descend into autocratic rule from which they can't come back.
Congresswoman, great to have you come in. Thank you
very
much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right, stay with us.